What a Friday for John McMullen, our 97.3 ESPN Eagles Insiders. He got to take a field trip all the way from the NovaCare complex over to Lincoln Financial Field, I'm sure, and just running around on a Friday. Just another boring Friday. Ho-hum. Right, John? Nothing going on up there, right?
Nothing ever going on with the Eagles. You know that, Pete.
I mean,
they keep out of the news. There's always something going on with this team. It doesn't matter what day of the year it is. It seems like the Eagles are always number one on people's minds.
In the commercial break, Scott Grayson turns to me and says, the Eagles just sent out a tweet that said, what, Scott Grayson?
Oh, yeah, it was funny. The Eagles sent out a tweet. Will Sidney Jones be activated for Sunday? Find out now on their Eagles update.
Come on, Eagles. You can't tease your own fan base like that.
Yeah. Well, I call it state-run media. In-house, they're trying to go that direction. The Eagles aren't the only team, by the way. The entire NFL is trying to go in that direction as best they can. But the smart and savvy fan knows you're not going to get there's good, there's bad, there's indifference, and you're only going to get the positive spin coming out of Eagles.com. But that's understandable. I mean, they're no different than any other team from that perspective.
I think from my Temple University PR major days where I was studying, I think they called that a house organ. That was what the company newsletter was called. Well, that's essentially nowadays in 2017 what PhiladelphiaEagles.com is, right? It's the house organ. It's the internal.
Yeah, and, if you want happy, and positive, that's where you should go.
Well, we love also cantankerous and, a little bit annoyed, and that would be Johnny Mack at times, right? Tell us then how the day went with some injuries came out, because we had Drew Davison on. He was talking about some of the Cowboys injuries and guys that are going to miss. Who's going to miss this game for the Eagles?
Well, only two guys have been ruled out, and that's Brandon Graham and obviously Joe Walker's now on injured reserve. How that magically happened because he was obviously out with the stinger. Then he was healthy, not on the injury report before the Raiders game, and now it magically shows up again because they want to open a spot up for Sidney Jones. And I always thought it was going to come down to Joe Walker or probably Marcus Johnson or Shelton Gibson as guys who could possibly go to make room for Sidney Jones if they wanted to go in that direction. They've made their decision, and you will see at some point, I imagine, either later today or even tomorrow, where they tell you that Sidney's active and he's on the 53-man roster.
With all signs pointing that way, John, how much would you expect to see of Sidney? The whole game?
No. I mean, he hasn't played a football game since, ironically, a calendar year on Sunday. 365 days ago, he was in the Peach Bowl for the University of Washington against Alabama. That's his last live football game he's played, and then he tore his Achilles, obviously, at his pro day. So there's no way he's got the conditioning or the ability to play 60 snaps on the defensive side of the ball. I imagine they'll mix him in to see what he has. But Doug has made it clear the starters are going to play. We'll see how much. I think certain guys will still sit. Names like Fletcher Cox, perhaps, Malcolm Jenkins, players like that. But from an offensive standpoint, when you have Nick Foles out there, you almost have to have the entire starting offense out there because otherwise it's not worth it. So a lot on that side of the ball depends on how much they want to see out of Nick Foles. And then defensively, again, you'll see a lot of Rasul Douglas. You'll see a lot of Jalen Watkins, and Sidney will be in that mix.
When you look at the you mentioned Jalen Mills, and he's been nursing this sore ankle. Would it be perhaps advantageous for the Eagles to just not dress him on Sunday?
Yeah, it's a possibility. I mean, they have to sort of weigh. I mean, people have to understand, and Doug's explained this week, I mean, this is not the preseason where you have 90 guys. You only have 46 to choose from. So certain guys have to play. I mean, that's just the mathematical reality of the situation. And then you talk about special teams. But Obviously, certain guys are banged up. You see the guys who are on the injury report. Brandon's out. Derek Barnett, for instance, dealing with a groin. Jalen's on there with the ankle. So some of those guys are the more logical. Jalen seems fine from a physical standpoint. He's certainly a younger player. I don't think he needs that much rest. Ultimately, I don't think he's going to be one of the guys that's completely shut down. But we'll see. Doug's been very clandestine about it all.
What has the body language been like from the guys this week? Does it seem like it's just kind of not the same they've been week to week throughout the rest of the season? This is kind of an opportunity where mentally they can kind of disengage a little bit, or are they really kind of keying in and looking to try to set that franchise record for wins in a regular season?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, but it's not as important as getting to the divisional round as healthy as possible. I think it would be a nice feather in everyone's cap. I mean, this team's been around for a long time, and obviously they haven't been playing 16 games that entire time, but no team in the history of this franchise has ever gotten to 14. So I think they want to get there, but the reality is that if they don't get there, it's not the end of the world, and they're not going to break their backs trying to get that record. And from the players' perspective, I think there's a little bit of a sigh of relief and sort of satiated that they've won the NFC East. They have the number one seed, and everything goes through Philadelphia. But they have bigger goals than the Dallas Cowboys. There's no question about that.
How do you think Doug has handled the team this week? Like we said, it's a week where the game doesn't matter, but it does, but it doesn't. And he's given them 2 walkthroughs. He's given them today where they went over and had a little field trip to practice inside the link because the fields were frozen over at NovaCare, and he wanted to keep them outside. How do you think he's handled this week, from the head coach's perspective?
Well, I think Doug's done a pretty good job all year, to be honest, pushing the right buttons. I mean, there's a reason they're 13-2, and they are where they are, and have been able to get around a number of significant injuries that go far beyond Carson Wentz. So from that standpoint, he's generally pushed the right buttons. But remember, they scaled things back last week. And there are a lot of players talking about the lack of execution, and Doug brought it up himself today. So I asked him about the scaling back to the walkthroughs instead of the practices and how that can affect the execution of the team. And it certainly didn't help the offense. But you can look at it that way, but spin it the other way and say the defense did just fine against the Oakland Raiders. They were tremendous, especially in the second half. So I think it more has to do, obviously, with the poor play at the quarterback position, and that needs to change. And I think that's what Week 17 is about, is trying to get some confidence back into the quarterback and that offense as a whole.
John McMullen with us, our 97.3 ESPN Eagles Insider. John's appearance brought to you by Geno's, the winemaker's choice for 50 years. Visit Gino Pinto on the White Horse Pike in Hamilton. Online at GinoPinto.com. It's Geno's, the winemaker's choice for 50 years. Well, in that answer, John, that you asked him about with the walkthroughs versus full-scale practice, the key phrase, Doug likes these phrases, and his phrase was mental reps in that one. As I read through the transcript today, I think it's hard, John, to get a head coach on a week they're playing Dallas to say the name of any other team than Dallas. And so kudos to Damo, who actually used the word pre-scouting to then get a bunch of other teams. So what was that back and forth about?
Well, I think, I think Damo should drop the mic today because he also got retweeted by former President Barack Obama. So we're all joking that Damo can now officially retire and move on to whatever he wants to do. But in the reality of looking ahead, I think a lot of it stems from the fact of what Sean McVay is doing with the Rams, and it certainly looks like he's jockeying to face the Eagles in the second round if he gets there. And we've a number of us have tried to talk to the players about it, and everybody has been focused from week to week with this team, trying not to look ahead, and they've been on point as far as message, and I think that comes from the head coach. But Doug admitted today that, yeah, they look at the possibilities that could be there in the divisional round. They're not going to game plan or anything of that nature, but the analytics people look at the probabilities and the reality of who is more likely to be there than not. And that's the extent of it. I don't think the coaching staff or anybody of that nature is all that focused on anything but the Dallas Cowboys because, hey, if you start preparing, first of all, you don't know who you're going to play 100%, no matter what the probabilities say. And secondly, you're just going to get out of what got you here. And that's sort of that same focus in how you prepare week after week after week, that doesn't change in the playoffs. It's the same as it is in the regular season.
And we don't know if former President Obama was watching John Gruden on Monday Night Football rave about this guy, but I should have mentioned that it was the article about Chris Long playing for free, that he gave his paychecks away to fund that scholarship in Charlottesville, Virginia. So, yeah, Damo mic drop. Former POTUS retweeting your tweet. You're in, right?
Yeah, he's in, but I want to criticize Barack Obama a little bit. That's an old story. Come on, Barack. You got to keep up on your news. That story's from like a month ago.
John, I noticed that Doug was asked about Stefan Wisniewski. They've obviously missed him, right. But he, it sounds like, is going to play on Sunday, and Peterson wants to see him.
Yeah, he said basically that he was going to play, and that obviously he's missed 2 games, and Doug said he needs to play, needs to get back into it, get a feel for it. And I think it's also going back to the whole situation where you want to get that first-team offense on the same page and some confidence, and getting him back as a part of that as the starting left guard. And as I said, with the Nick Foles reps, and everyone acknowledges pretty much that he does need more work, that part of it's fine to say, but if the starters aren't out there, more work doesn't mean anything. He's got to get work with those guys. Uh-huh. So it affects the whole sort of plan as far as how much you want to play Elaine Johnson or somebody of that nature. And that's one of the bad parts of the poor performance against Oakland, because you feel the need to play these guys more than perhaps you would have if the Eagles played well.
I wanted to ask you about Jim Schwartz, because there's some rumors floating around now that he might be considered for the New York Giants job. But in general, there's going to be some Eagles coaches that are going to have their names floated around as the Eagles go through this playoff run. How much of a distraction or not a distraction do you think that could be for this team?
I don't like the way the NFL does it. I've never liked the way they do it. You're allowed to interview on the bye week if you have that first-round bye. So you're going to see interviews probably from Jim Schwartz, probably from Frank Reich, and maybe even John DeFilippo. 3 different coaches may go on interviews that week when the Eagles are technically off, but will be at work. And it's been going on for years. I mean, it's no different than any other team. Minnesota's probably going to get that number 2 seed, and Pat Shurmur's going to go through the same thing. Their offensive coordinator, he's going to get interviews. It happens to every team every year. So while it doesn't seem like the best way to go about doing things, it's just a reality of the NFL. Everybody knows it, and it's sort of business as usual. You can't look at it. Most guys are in that position for a reason, to be in the conversation to be a head coach. And if you're in that conversation, you're not going to ignore your old job, because you would never be in that position. So I wouldn't be concerned about it.
John McMullen with us, also covers the league nationally as well. And report in the last couple minutes here, John, where the Buccaneers have told Dirk Cutter that he's safe for 2018. You buying that report? Are you surprised to hear a headline like that?
No, not totally, because I think they have a young quarterback, obviously, who kind of took a step back. And I think the last thing you want to do in this league, and I say it all the time, it's one thing if you're like the Los Angeles Rams and you have a young quarterback who completely failed in Jared Goff during his rookie season, then you can look to make a change. But if you had a quarterback who's had some success, and Winston certainly did with Dirk Cutter, that's the original reason they elevated him and fired Lovie Smith, to keep him around. I think the best route is continuity. I always think it's continuity. I think if you saw what's happened to the Raiders, I think that's directly attributable to getting rid of their offensive coordinator, Bill Musgrave, and going to Todd Downing, who is completely in over his head. And they've taken sort of a disastrous step. So I think continuity is always better in the NFL. And people talking about 13, 14 job openings, it was never going to be that many. It's always going to be 7 or 8. And you kind of see it. Todd Bowles is back with the Jets, and now you're hearing Dirk Cutter. It's going to be more that than you expect.
John McMullen with us here. Now, John, there's also reports out there about the dysfunctional relationship between Bill O'Brien and Rick Smith. You don't want to have your head coach and GM screaming and yelling at each other, right? Or not talking at all.
Yeah, they don't like each other, and that's the problem. And it tends to be when you get in that type of situation, the most obvious example of that recently would be Trent Baalke in San Francisco with Jim Harbaugh. And it generally comes down to who does the owner like better in those types of power struggles. We saw it in Philadelphia with Chip Kelly and Howie Roseman, which is a surprise. Jeffrey Lurie went in the original direction and then did a complete 180, which turned out to be the better decision. But nonetheless, who's got the ear of Bob McNair? People around the league say it's probably Rick Smith. I will say if Bill O'Brien gets fired, he'll get calls before he reaches his car in the parking lot. I mean, he's not going to be unemployed for long.
Hey,
and by the way, I think that would be a terrible decision. Just as what I was saying with the young quarterbacks, Bill O'Brien has already proved he can put up historic numbers with Deshaun Watson. I don't want to change offensive systems with Deshaun Watson in his second season. I think that would be disastrous for Houston, but it wouldn't surprise me if they moved on.
Once upon a time, the Raiders traded John Gruden to the Bucs. That was 16 years ago. What if the Texans trade Bill O'Brien instead of firing him?
Yeah, I think people are smarter now. I really do.
You'd like to think that.
Well, yeah, it only takes one. Anytime you always say that, it's like whether it's picking a player or hiring a coach. We all joked about Jeff Fisher trying to get a job. And I think the majority of teams would laugh at hiring a guy like Jeff Fisher. But it only takes one. It only takes one organization. So if a lot of people speculated O'Brien to the Giants as well, Scott mentioned Jim Schwartz earlier. He would be another name if he became available. I don't think Dave Gettleman would trade for him, but it only takes one. But you rarely see those coaches trades anymore, and I think there's a reason for that, and probably a good reason.
John, the Eagles really love DeFilippo. I mean, they blocked him from being able to go anywhere last year. If Frank Reich were to get a gig somewhere, would you see DeFilippo as the natural choice to be the offensive coordinator?
Oh, no question. He would be elevated the next day to be the offensive coordinator. The question is he going to be a head coach somewhere else? I think Sean McVay and the success he's had has sort of created this theory that people want young offensive minds who are good with the quarterback position, and obviously John is in that category because of the work he's done with Carson Wentz. But I brought up a name earlier with the Raiders, Todd Downing. That was their theory. Their theory was that Downing was the quarterback coach. He did such a good job on a day-to-day basis with Derek Carr. They didn't want to lose him. So they didn't extend Bill Musgrave, and they elevated him to coordinator. And sometimes people are good position coaches, and they're not good coordinators. And that's what happened with the Raiders. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen with John, but Frank Reich is a good coordinator. We already know that. And it's not going to be automatic that anybody can do the same job that Frank Reich has done.
Curious for your thoughts on this, John, because it seems that Jason Garrett has not a fan favorite in Dallas, but for whatever reason he is Jerry Jones' guy, and he keeps surviving down there. What is it about him that Jerry Jones sticks with?
Well, he does what Jerry says. Jerry Jones has been through Jimmy Johnson and Bill Parcells, and he doesn't like guys who are headstrong and are going to go against his wishes and do what they feel is best for their football team as the head coach. He wants a guy who's going to do what he's instructed to do, and that's Jason Garrett. And by the way, I don't think he's a terrible coach. I think he's average to above average, but he's not. He's what Jerry Jones wants, and he's not going to be a guy who bucks the system or goes outside the lines. He's very understands his role, and the second part of that is he's still got a number of years left on his contract for big money, so Jerry doesn't want to pay that off and also hire a new coach. So when you put those two things together, yeah, he's just going to move forward in the same way, and he's had some success. The problem with Dallas is the inconsistency. One year they win 13 games, the next year they're down. The next year it was 12, then down, then 13, then down. And that's been the Dallas Cowboys, inconsistency.
John McMullen, our 97.3 ESPN Eagles insider. He covers the NFL as well for 97.3ESPN.com. And our website was where he had his prediction up first for the game. I don't know if Sidney Jones potentially playing changes your prediction at all, John, but since it is Friday, what say you score prediction-wise?
I think it's going to be a lot like last year, and it was a reversal where the Cowboys had locked things up and didn't play Ezekiel Elliott, Teron Smith. They took out Dak Prescott early, and the Eagles won the football game. I think it's going to be the exact opposite this time around. I think the Cowboys will probably win because the Eagles aren't going to play their significant players all that much. And I don't think it's going to mean anything amount to a hill of beans, but I just think the Cowboys are going to play more of what they have available, and they'll probably win the football game.
And 23-14 is your prediction.
Yeah, which these types of games, Week 17, when nobody has anything to play for, they're impossible to predict. So I'm just throwing it out there. Dart at the dartboard.
Au contraire, John McMullen. Our listeners have a chance to play for $900. It's Pick the Perfect Score when we come back. Thank you, John. Appreciate you coming on with us. I know we'll talk after the new year, so there's no show Monday. We'll talk to you, I assume, on Tuesday once we get into 2018 and lots of storylines. Always that boring Philadelphia Eagles, but look forward to it. Happy New Year, John.
All right. Happy New Year, guys.